This meeting is being recorded.
Hey everybody, I assume we're waiting for Kaushik. He's going to start the meeting. I'm not sure who started recording, but
he's on holiday, I think, John. He sent a mail. Kaushik is on holiday, I think.
I think that just starts. Oh, I guess, yeah, because it's in the, no, that starts tomorrow, I think.
Ah, okay. Because he said 31st inclusive.
I thought he said the first, but
okay.
I think Sanaa is joining.
okay,
cool.
Great.
Or should be.
Hello, everyone.
Hey there, Sanaa, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Wait a minute, it does say the 31st. Yeah.
It's 9:03. Should we get started? I think I'm seeing a couple of more people joining still.
I think it's fine. It's recorded. So why don't you go ahead?
Okay, perfect. Let's make the best use of our time. So we finished our last meeting on Thursday with a couple of action items. We wanted to dig deeper into the R2 deliverables in terms of looking at what R1 delivered. And then we have received some additional feedback from DT. I have added my feedback from Telesys side. I have looked at the document structure. How should we proceed? Wim, do you want to take your action items first, or do you want me to give the recap of the document first, and then we take a look at your document?
Either way works.
Okay, give me one sec. I will quickly share the current state of the requirements document just to see where we are and recap on what we did on Thursday. And then we'll hand it over to you, Wim, so that you can walk us through what you have put together. So everyone has access to the document. If you go to your Slack, you can see it's pinned right here. Kaushik is on vacation right now, and we have a couple of more meetings left to put this document in the final stage. And I was hoping that we could give this to SIG Automation for review by this Thursday. So anyone who has not given their inputs or reviewed the document or given your feedback into it, please do so. I'm going to join tomorrow's meeting as well, in which we'll probably look at the Helm integration options and see what requirements can we extract from that. So in the beginning, we have the related documents and background, some key considerations that we are working on this evolution of Nephew along these vertical lines, defining our APIs, defining our interfaces, some design requirements that we have put here. And then on the use cases, we have this section in which we are looking at the potential possibilities of how do we extend what we have done in R1. And if we can find one of these permutations of options of a commercial 5G core with RAN element. And all of these options are actually in the order of priority. We might end up to using just open source because that might be the most available or the easiest to work with within a scope of 3 months for R2. But the other options are just from the community to create the desire and to show that that's what we should be looking for. So the main theme requirements are there. The sidetrack user stories are presented on the section. I've received input from Bernard. Most of his focus was very infrastructure focused. We should give some time to Bernard to walk us through his requirements as well. And I haven't seen Eric yet presenting his detailed requirements, but Eric has done a very good job with giving us the long-term requirements on the other document. He just needs to basically pick some of those ideas and present for R2 because that's where we are trying to consolidate the document for. I see some input coming from just Sandeep, but I think this is from the older meetings, and that's it. And then we had some action items for Wim to help us complete the background in R1 section a little bit better. I will hand it over to you and stop sharing my stream, Wim, so that you can walk us through your action items.
Sana, sorry to interrupt. The bottom I have added my comments actually in context of security and hardening in the blue colors. Yeah.
Sandeep, yeah, okay. So this is a new section, right?
Yeah, in the track where we are keeping all the tracks. So I'm just adding it there. This is the new track.
Sandeep, yeah, it would be good if you can put a little bit more requirement in the form of a user story. So if you
Sana,
consider
just
the main
correction. This is Subhash.
Subhash, I'm sorry. Okay, Subhash, perfect. So if you can, if you have included that, that's good. So if you want to provide a requirement from your side, would be good if you can turn this into a user story like we have done for these examples, considering the sidetrack, which means that you have a 5G core, R1 is done. Keep that context in mind. We are looking at the potential extension of our 5G into some elements of ORAN and then providing the cross integration. When you have that context in mind, how do you turn your security recommendations, the policy framework, just a little bit of more detail in the context that we are looking for?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Any other questions before I close this document?
Sana,
And
some
we
of
will-
some
Go
of
ahead.
my action points are in the document, so I put some text in the beginning.
Okay, we'll stay on this. I saw on the Slack that you had made some slides. So
Also,
I-
yeah, so there is two sections. One is the wait, so I'll go a bit further down. No. There was a section down. Yeah, there.
I put your name here, so I think maybe that's where you put.
So
some
the
stuff.
text below I put, yeah.
Excellent. So you want me to keep the control, or do you want me to give you the control?
Yeah, for this, this fairly straightforward, I think.
Okay.
But at
Okay.
least it's written down. Yeah. So keep this, and then once we are through this, then we can go to the slides. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And at that stage, I'll give you the control, and you can share then.
Yeah.
Okay, Wim, go ahead. I see your
There
text
is one
entered in.
more. Is there Suba raised his hand? Is that stale or?
It's stale one.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys.
Yes.
When I'm in the shared screen mode, I'm unable to see the full raised hand. So thank you so much, Wim, for helping me.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, so one of the questions that was on the table, I think on Thursday, or one of the discussion was what to give a bit more insight on the main limitations that we have in R1 with respect to the network function. So I wrote down, because we in SIG automation, we had a session on Wednesday where we discussed more the technical depth side of things. So there is a few things that are probably not relevant here. So I basically took the main item that is relevant in this context out, which is what I wrote down here, is that today there is a number of, actually a lot of parameters that are basically hard-coded. So what that means is that, for example, if those parameters you want to change, at the moment you cannot, right? So what are those parameters? For example, the slicing ID, tracking area. So a lot of them are to do with 3GPP specific items that are not, customizable. And the other thing that people have to bear in mind is that, I mean, we did do, one of the use cases was to change the capacity, right? And that leads towards, let's say, a restart. Now, this in my, or at least my understanding is this is specific to FreeFive.GC, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I just listed those two as the main things that you see that is not, that release 1 does not cover, let's say, well. And I see two ways to go about it, by the way. One way is to keep on the theme of immutable infrastructure, in the sense that allowing those parameters to be configurable, but if you change them, you restart, like we do with FreeFive.GC. So this is what I call the immutable way of handling change. And so you basically start something new when you have a change. And the alternative to that is really when you do it in a live system. So that needs quite some changes, probably, because there you need to do changes of configuration during the lifetime of that network function. So that is a second approach that I see. So yeah, so that's basically what I didn't want to go into the solution in this document yet. But these are, of course, the implications of them are very different, right? And so in the immutable way, I think it's way easier from an automation machinery point of view to accommodate that, because you don't have to do much, right? But of course, it might have service impacting implications, right? Because you have to restart. If you have, of course, a secondary that can take over, you don't have that. But yeah, I just wanted to list the two that I see as potential solutions.
Excellent. Wim, I have one more question. The hard-coded parameters and the inability of making it very dynamic configurations, whatever you've experienced in R1, would you be seeing this exact same problem in the other commercial products for 5.3 following 3GPP specs as well?
No. This is just, I think we have so much time in R1 that we were very focused on the user stories that we got, right? So we have been very focused on those. And so because
okay, you simplified this for yourself.
Yeah, it's a shortcut that we took, in my view. But yeah, if we had more time, we could probably do something with it. And probably not a full-blown enchilada, but the limited version that allowed change. I think the immutable option is rather straightforward to do, because it actually, you will see later into the slide how we could extend Nevio in R1 with vendor-specific parameters. It's along the same lines, and of course,
perfect.
Then it's the vendor implementation that could deal with the immutability or not immutability. So that means that's not yet a Nevio problem. and that we can then take it later. So for example, you will see in one of the slides, one of the things that I'm experimenting with vendor specific parameters is a way that you can also achieve those configuration parameters to be made configurable. But then it's up to the operator that sits at the workload cluster that depends on how he deals with that change. And in the immutable way, you just restart. In the non-immutable way, you actually change the configuration of the running system.
Perfect.
Maybe for that, it might be good to share the slides.
Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah, I was thinking I will stop sharing and then you can take control.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll jump immediately to the last slide. I shared these slides, but maybe I maybe jump here immediately. Is this clear?
Yeah,
do you see this?
Yeah.
So I've skipped a few slides, so maybe for people, and yeah, so they are very rudimentary. But if you look to, I forget the orange part that you see on the screen. So if you look to Nephew R1, the way we work is that we have a blueprint package that is assembled, and I have a set of slides also with respect to that to clarify for the people who are not doing practical usage of it, how it looks like. And because I also took an action to help explain you how it works in order to discuss these roles and responsibilities and so on and so forth, right? But in a nutshell, so what we have is we have blueprint packages. So we have one for SMF, UPF, and AMF. And actually we have also for all the other components, but we don't do anything with it, right? And then what we take that package, we through the package variant set and package variant, which is part of Porch, we decide where such package should be deployed. So that can be what you see here on this slide. On this part is actually a per cluster set of artifacts that are in a per cluster repo at the moment, right? So this is that. And so you can decide here using some configuration parameters to decide, okay, I only deploy it on the region. And then if there's only one cluster in the region, you get it there. If you deploy it on the edges, so in the demo that we have in R1, we have one cluster for region and we have two clusters for edge, right? Just to make it easy. So you can say deploy it everywhere or deploy it only on region or deploy it only on edge. So depending on that, it will either get scheduled and get fanned out into this specific package. So basically you keep track of the source and then we contextualize during that fan out process or variation process, we contextualize that package with additional information. Okay, Bernard, you have a question?
Yes, my question is regarding how dynamic this fan out procedure can be. So just imagine that we have one edge site going down and we need to sort of shift the workload to another edge site and would require that sort of from the available clusters, we then prepare that cluster to account for this, the network specific configurations of the workloads. And this is something which would have to happen dynamically and not as a predefined definition. So my question would be, would that dynamic sort of fan out mechanism also be supported in this setup?
Yeah, I think John wants to answer that.
Yeah, I can jump in. So the short answer is yes. You know, there's a question of sort of latency, right? Like how quickly do you need to react, right? Like you tend to divide these things into a few categories, right? This is this sort of site level, go to this cluster, create a cluster over here, right? That will take time as opposed to, you know, instant failover type of things, right? So yes, it is dynamic. The fan out, for example, operates on a label selector. We have a very simple, the package variant set is very, very simple, right? It's just list of targets and then it specializes it per target. But if a cluster comes and goes, a new cluster pops up, it'll see that in the label selector and it'll install something there. Now in R1, we don't have all the intercluster networking. There's pieces missing in the full automation story, which we talked about in past calls. But I hope in R2 we'll resolve those, at least in our certain situation, certain test environments. And but the idea is that package variant set's very simple, but you could actually create a more dynamic topology controller, which we hope to provide an example of at some point, that manages that based on other criteria. Right now it's just a label selector, but you could, and we don't have the feedback mechanisms for it. We know it went down. There's a number of pieces missing to make that happen, but effectively the dynamic nature of it is there.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I'm asking is basically also related to the specialization step, because just imagine that we sort of then shift the workload from a sort of, let's say, edge side to a core side, and then the specialization has to be different to account for that.
Yes,
and
and
that we do.
Specialization.
We do.
So the idea is, okay, so when we say injection, it's sort of part of fan out. It's we stage it. When we say injection, what we're talking about is the deployer, or says, I want these network functions on this label set of clusters selected by this set of labels. Now the infrastructure engineers that are creating clusters, or it's an automated tool that's creating clusters, part of what they're doing is they're populating certain data in the management cluster about those clusters. So when we say injection, that's sort of the combining of those two things. One is the deployer's intent to distribute it across a set of clusters. The other is the contextual information about whatever cluster gets created. And then the specialization comes in after those two things are combined to do things like allocate IP addresses, allocate VLAN tags, whatever you need in order to actually actualize it on that particular thing. So that's all dynamic. And the idea is to separate those sources of information so that there's not a hard process or organizational dependency between those two.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, the contextualization, as John was saying, provides you that information, and then the functions use that in order to have a per location or per location in this case specific set of parameters that will be actuated.
Yeah. So the approach is currently based on labels. That means you have to somehow sort of say that sort of if I'm deploying a certain network function, please make sure that the infrastructure sort of accounts for the following labels so that it can really run in that environment, because otherwise might be that certain features are missing, or connectivity and so on might not be available, etc. So then sort of you're delegating a little bit sort of this alignment to sort of proper labeling of the environments and sort of aligning that sort of with the network program. Yeah, and that's one of the things where I was just wondering if we could try to be a little bit more specific about the roles and responsibilities here, sort of how we would sort of account for the different capabilities, SIV, huge pages, network connections, etc., that we think about sort of what mechanisms would we employ here to account for that.
So that's a great, so if I could I think that what you're saying, so we do differentiate. So there's things we can discover, and there's things that are metadata that have to be provided by a human or system. So SRIOV, we should be able to discover clusters that have that. So if we have a requirement, and it's not all built out yet that we can do that, right? We don't have like a sophisticated scheduler right now. It's just labels, like you said. But you're absolutely right. Like ideally, what we would have is the network function could say, I have these requirements: SRIOV, huge pages, certain amount of capacity on network, access to particular networks, etc. Like there's probably a huge list. And the idea is, yes, we would have a scheduler that can discover that about the locations, say, for lack of a better term, but there's also information like a site ID or a region that's going to be fed into downstream systems during specialization, so that if you're in this particular site, then the VPC RAN network is on this subnet or this VLAN, and so that has to be fed into the right place.
two things. The
That's
selection,
demographic.
yep, sorry. Yeah. So the selection process is one part. Then the handover of parameters in a well-defined manner. Sort of where do I get sort of certain parameters? And what I also would like to mention is that what we would like to do is we would like to have, let's say, some kind of, rather generic class sort of hardware environments, which can be customized to the specific needs of the workloads. Yeah. And so therefore, it's not only about discovering sort of which environment is capable of potentially hosting that, but also making sure that before you do the onboarding of the network function, that, for instance, kernel modules are available, etc., so that sort of the deployment can really work.
Yeah, so that would be an interesting thing to dig deeper into in R2 for sure. Like this is where I'm hoping to get the information from this group of like what do we dig into, because or maybe R3, like if R2 is really in November, there's not all that much time, but like let's get a plan for which of these things are most important, because those are, I think, yeah, super interesting things to demonstrate.
Yeah. We have some, but not a lot. There is a few of these things, but not it's not extensive or exhaustive.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on this, Pim. Good discussion, and I was thinking that maybe we'll be able to accomplish some things in R2, and maybe we'll extend some of this to beyond. What I was thinking is really important is basically the intent-based deployment model. So I'm asking a very fundamental question. How do we balance the intent in that? For example, a person maybe sitting on the marketplace or somewhere very high up the stack is thinking that I need to deploy a UPF. Maybe it's an edge UPF and I want to deploy it in X, Y, or Z region. And the person doesn't care at all about which clusters are ready to take this workload, which clusters are pre-configured. So how much of that has to be prepared ahead of time? Because there are sometimes the hardware requirements on certain regions which are actually ready for taking that kind of workload. Not every region is exactly identical. And so is in the private cloud. Like we know exactly that this particular regions and those clusters are capable of taking on the UPF workload, for example, with all the additional requirements. And then some of these configurations are actually could be applied dynamically, like Bernard mentioned. So to what degree is this going to be purely intent-based and dynamic? It's the same question. I'm just putting in a different way.
Yeah, so it's similar to the thing. I mean, maybe we should first go to what a package contains and how it works, but because that probably will clarify. But yeah, but I think maybe one thing I see what we see. So this resource, right? So the workload cluster resource is a resource that we defined in Nefio, and today it's statically providing some parameters, right? So like I can do Azure IOV, I can do Mac VLAN, I can do DCNI. So we mainly focused on call it the network infra part, right? But at the moment that CR, so it will get dynamically injected inside of the package based on where it gets deployed, right? So in other words, this is a placeholder for that. What will happen when you say, I want to schedule this package onto this site, you will get the site-specific information, right? Now, that site-specific information at the moment is something that we kind of hard-coded. So we don't, like John said, we don't discover this information at the moment. So one of the things that we should do, or we should extend with, is the discovery capability of what are the capabilities of that cluster, right? And probably extend it to a set of elements like what type of, so we already know the NICs, we already know what the NICs are capable, what networking capabilities it has, but we should extend it to what is the NUMA layout, what is the, some additional parameters that we at the moment do not have, right? And then we can do more. So at the moment it's contained to the parameters that we, you could say, statically defined. But if we have some more discover capabilities, we could do more dynamic, and we could extend the parameters to the ones beyond the ones that we have right now.
Yeah, I would say even like, I think it sounds like there's also one step even before that, right? Which is a concept of site, which we don't have right now, but we've talked about in the past, or I don't know if site's the right term, but there's a
region
bank
or
of hardware resources that we can
correct.
create clusters in, right? And those that's an even lower layer. That bank of resources has certain capabilities, and maybe there's a selection, you know, it all depends on the infrastructure, that provisioning platform you have. So how far down we want to go. So inventory of all of that, and then creation of clusters on top of that, scheduling, like all of those pieces are things we have. And by scheduling, I mean like choosing this network function needs these resources. So now we need a cluster like this. Oh, we don't have a cluster like that. Okay, we have hardware like this in these places. We need to, you know, schedule clusters onto sites. We need to schedule workloads onto clusters. All of that we haven't done. And so if that's priority, then that's, you know, that's something we can start looking into. But the goal is to have that be fully declarative and have that separation of provisioning and consumption.
Right. John and Wim, since we are at a very interesting point, and this is going to help us create some more ideas, generate more ideas for R2, like what is it that we should emphasize on, what's doable or what's achievable, like in the short term. So if I am that user who's requesting for a UPF deployment in certain region, and these are the mechanisms for us to be able to supply some of these parameters dynamically, can you walk me through your thought process on the experience? Like the person who is triggering the request for the UPF deployment, he probably doesn't give you all the information at all. So how does the flow goes? Like where do we find, okay, that's UPF. So here's the package for UPF, and this is the artifacts associated with UPF. And since the person gave me the input only in a single API form, and that has just the information about the region or a site or this, maybe not cluster, but super high level in that. And you translate your existing package and you dynamically assign some of your resource level requirements into that. So do you expect the presence of an inventory to be able to supply those parameters dynamically?
I mean, I think Wim's probably his best is what his deck is about. We should let him go through it. I think that effectively is the idea is there's different roles, there's different people and or systems populating different sets of inventory and capability and capacity, and then you can consume those at different layers. But let's let Wim talk through it.
Okay, we'll just listen to him then.
I don't have everything yet, but yeah, so what we do, for example, one of the things that I was going to highlight indeed, as John was saying, is we have labeled some, so you see here, at the moment they represent a cluster, right? These things. So we have assigned, so someone have assigned labels to these elements that we use to do selection and decide where it should go and stuff like that. So that is something that a person deploying this has used or has done, right? Before this actually works or can work. But yeah, so let me first explain the whole, let's say, architecture a little bit better. I'm not sure whether we cover everything, but at least we can discuss. So we start with a blueprint package. So Sana, towards your point, at the moment, we only defined one blueprint package for UPF, SMF, and AMF. Our idea was always, if you have different, let's say, the example I always use is we have mass market packet code and we have enterprise, right? So just to say, and most likely the flavors or the set of requirements are a bit different for one or the other. So we would basically define a different blueprint package for the mass market versus the enterprise one. Okay, so that's what the blueprint package represents. So towards your question with respect to, okay, I have a person and he wants a certain flavor, so so that flavor would basically select a specific blueprint package for a certain core that he would select. Okay, and then you have another set of parameters to say where it has to go, right? So, and that's basically what those three buckets at the moment here represent. It's a cluster, right? And the cluster has certain labels assigned with respect to its location at the moment, mostly, but those labels can mean anything. And they are at the moment statically defined. So that's part of that discovery capability, right? And then what happens, so we provide context to, so this, you go through a pipeline, if you will, right? So we always keep track of where we started. So the reference of the source is kept across the chain. And what I try to represent with the color is the, let's say, new resources will be injected, or additional or resources will be changed inside of the packet, or resources will be added inside of the packet based on your pipeline that you use to hydrate that. And you will see during that whole process, you'll see changes appearing within that package based on the contextual information typically that is identified during that process. So like an IP address, like a VLAN, so specific parameters for that environment will be actuated for based on where you deploy. Okay. And then once we are happy, we have a set of artifacts that we believe are that needs to be deployed. You can, we at the moment in R1 we have an auto approver, so we can auto approve, or you can actually go through a CI/CD chain before you put it to the workload cluster, right? Now, so why did I explain this? I wanted to explain actually first of all how we could do the 3GPP parameters that we are not deploying. So at the moment, if you look to a KRM, I saw such a blueprint package, which I also have in the slides. You see that there is a set of parameters that we do not identify. For example, like tracking areas, or which are also regionalized, by the way, or slicing, which can also be regionalized. So there is a set of parameters that we do not focus upon, or we don't do anything about. So one way to support that, and by the way, that's also similar to how I'm experimenting at the moment with a vendor-specific extension. So what you could do is you add a specific CR inside of that package that is either vendor-specific or contains a set of parameters that this whole pipeline at the moment does not know anything about, right? So that's one way. So this piece here on the right-hand side is optional, right? So basically you would say, I just add a CR inside of that package, and an example of that is what I put here, right? So yeah, we didn't go to the beginning of the presentation, so, but you'll see that I have basically added this piece here inside of that UPF deployment, which would be a vendor specific, or could actually be whatever we pick, right? And that config reference is a reference of additional information that would be going through that workload cluster. So so assume that nothing has to be parameterized from that configuration, then you don't need this component. So basically what you put here will go straight to the workload cluster. And then I'm assuming that there is a vendor specific operator that understands what is in here. Or in the case of the free 5GC, we would have to extend our free 5GC operator with that CR that we add into that package, which contain those parameters. And then that would then be actuated on the workload cluster. So that is the very simple way of achieving that. And then it depends on this operator, what type of capabilities it has, whether it can do it in an immutable way or in a non-immutable way. So, but that's basically a very simple way. Of course, and I think Kiran, before I give you the mic, yeah, so this function here, or this component here is optional. And why am I saying that? So it's optional as long as you don't need these contextualized parameters that might come from one of those, let's say, locations, if you will, where that gets deployed. So as long as you don't need any of that, you don't need this component, then you only need the top and the bottom. Kiran, you have a question?
Wim, did you mean me?
No, Kiran from.
Kiran, but we can't hear you if you're talking.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we cannot hear you. No, we cannot He's back on mute, I think.
They have a mic problem. Kiran has a mic problem.
Yeah, okay, so that's so yeah, to do that configuration. So I jumped to this slide, but this was actually meant for vendor specific CR, but it's the same, it's along the same lines, right? So you could basically, we could edit here and then at the bottom, as long as you don't need any contextual information from the location on which something happened. If you would need to have some contextual information, most likely you will need to do something at this level for the time being. Or it depends, we have to look into the details where we can get that information from. Okay, no questions? Then maybe so this was an example that I am experimenting with at the moment on how to use R1 with this, right? So the other thing that I prepared was to give people a bit of better insight on how such a blueprint package, how they look like and what they contain. Also to understand a bit better on who has to assemble it and who is involved in that, right? So I took a look at the release 1 UPF, SMF, and AMF packages, and I categorized a package, and I have examples of the data into 4 categories, and some of them are related. So, but the first set of categories is the requirements that we put in that package, and so the requirements are related to some of these components. Then we have towards the discussion we had with Bernard and John and Sana, so the contextualized information. So there is some context information that we inject inside of those packages. Network at the moment is not dynamically injected, but so that's a shortcut that we took because we were a bit, we ran out of time. But the workload cluster is dynamically injected, so networks at the moment not. So this gives you context, right? And then there is a pipeline that we put together, plus some specific configuration with respect to that those pipelines need on how to, it's typically for these generic functions that they need in order to, let's say, mutate or mutate some of these resources, okay? So yeah, let's maybe go through. So I put together a set of slides which basically gives you that dump of a resource. So UPF deployment is fairly straightforward. There's nothing inside because we start from something empty. And so the goal of this whole pipeline, and by the way, what I'm showing right now is this blueprint package here at the top, right? So that's where everything starts from. So that's the component that we are discussing or looking at. So, and I think there is for me, the goal here is twofold. One is to show you the details. And secondly, one thing we should ask ourselves, is this okay? Is this okay to manage? And then the second thing is who has to do so, right? Because you see that there is a mix between contextual information and potentially vendor or infrastructure related things. So, but first thing is UPF deployment. So it's fairly straightforward. You don't need to do anything almost, right? Just say these are to do. So that's probably okay. And this is the piece that we are then going to get from the top, if you will, from here, which all the way will get what we call hydrated or specialized towards a point that you can deploy it, right? And that UPF deployment resource, so that CR will actually go to the workload cluster. And that's where the operator, the FreeFireGC operator that we built in R1 acts upon, okay? Plus the adjacent, plus additional references that you potentially put inside of the package like this. So you could extend this, so the CR is built in such a way that it's extensible with various configuration references, okay? So first thing is easy. The second thing is yeah, so then what you see is that we put, so this is also a capacity requirement. So for example, we are asking for a UPF which has 10 gig uplink and downlink capacity. Okay. Now, what is important to know or to note is that you see here there is basically two pieces in the annotation section that is actually also important. And so the reason I bring this up is to make you aware about it. And secondly, you can see that maybe we have to build some tools around it to auto generate this potentially, but that, or at least that's my view. So you see that one is we have to define whether, so this parameter basically tells you this resource here that is inside of the package should never go to the workload cluster, right? So that's what this parameter is about. So this allows us to add resources inside of that package or that blueprint package, which are just here to tell, okay, I want you to do something, but the result of that will be somewhere else. So, but this KRM resource is just there to put the requirements, and then some people will act upon that. And then the second set of things is, you see, we have to link this towards that UPF. So you see here that this thing is linked towards this UPF resource. And the reason we did this is because we believe that we have to support potentially multiple of these resources that would have each their own set of, let's say, adjacent resources that would be referenced. And by doing so, we allow that. Right? Okay, Bernard, you have a question?
My question would be sort of, how do we determine who needs to take care of these max uplink and max downlink requirements? That means I understand that the UPF says I need this from a sort of high level perspective, but it's not quite clear sort of who needs to take care of that.
The way it works at the moment, we don't do a lot with it at the moment, Bernard, but the way it works at the moment is that the operator at the bottom would configure its deployment with those resources based on these parameters. So in other words, you would deploy, maybe just to say small, medium, large, right? Based on the 10 gig, it's maybe the small or the medium, right? So the resources that you put on the deployment spec that are actually going to be actuated on the workload cluster will take into account these parameters.
Yeah, I think that that's what we do today, but I think just referencing the earlier discussion, like if this were a high level capacity that wasn't sort of UPF, this is UPF specific, I guess. So if you were saying you wanted to deploy this UPF and we didn't have, we can do one of two things, right? If you're telling us where to deploy it, we can validate, is that infrastructure it's going to land on, does it have the capacity? Can it be configured to have the capacity? The second thing is, if you're not necessarily telling us where to deploy it and you want us to select it, then we get back to that scheduling thing of like, oh, how does that demand boil down to lower level demands on the infrastructure? And I think we don't do any of that right now, but we're trying to build out the framework or the structure such that that's possible.
Yeah, just to highlight a little bit the situation which we sometimes have. You could imagine that the spec section where you've got these sort of uplink, downlink throughputs, you could of course create sort of a requirement for each type of linkage you have between different resources. But sometimes people are also starting to, how should I say, sort of put everything in one place. So having a guidance about sort of this should be ideally sort of related to the capabilities of one resource. It should take care of that. This type of alignment would be helpful, because otherwise you have to have lots of experts sitting together trying to find out which parameter belongs to whom and who needs to take care of it.
Well, I guess at some point we need, the idea is to structure these APIs based upon those roles. And so personally, I'm looking for guidance from this group as to what those roles are and what's within their domain of control. And obviously it might vary from organization to organization. But to some extent, hopefully we can draw some roles that, some APIs that this this is the deployer, this is some sort of infrastructure engineer, this is some sort of network planner, this is some sort of database that I don't know what all the different roles are, but I think that's a huge challenge, is designing those APIs, and we're going to be iterating on them over for a while. But that's the idea.
Yeah, thank you.
At the moment, we envision this to be the total capacity of a UPF, Bernard, but we can, of course, look at other ways, but that's how we envisioned it at the moment.
Yeah,
okay. Then I just took out.
Wim,
yes, sorry,
a quick question. Karen is putting his question in the chat, and his question is still open. If you open the chat window, you can read that, or maybe I can read that to you.
Wait, so I'll just get it. I rephrase. If we identify, isolate all the parts of minute.
Don't know if you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes,
Thanks,
we can hear you.
Managed to fix my microphone problem as well. So basically what I was wondering is, I mean, I guess we're testing with free 5G core at the minute, and there are specific, I guess you could call the free 5G core operators as sort of vendor specific for that specific capability. Are we, how confident are you that the vendor specific and the generic stuff are clearly separated from each other?
At the moment, so I'm taking one of our functions, Kira. And so what I see is that everything that we did, so like all of these, right? So capacity, interface, DNN, I don't have to change anything. I can take as is, right? So I'm even putting additional ones here that we don't, that Free5GC doesn't use, that we would use. But so what you see already, there is a set of them that we, the way we define it for us, we could leverage what we did in Nefio, and there will be others which have to come from somewhere else. So what I'm experimenting with is to reuse whatever we did in Nefio as much as possible, and then only take the pieces that we don't have and use that in this vendor-specific CR as I was showing before.
Yeah, so we've been pretty careful to keep those separate. I mean, the operator itself is Free5G specific because it's generating the config file for those workloads. But actually the resource that it processes, the UPF deployment resource, for example, is intended to be generic with references to vendor-specific resources. When you're only doing one vendor, there's certainly the danger that the structure of it is dictated by or overly trained on that one vendor. But that's why we're hoping to expand the number of vendors too, and start to understand whether we've done that right. But we've been pretty careful to be. We've built out the capabilities needed to support that, but we've tried to do it in a generic way.
Okay, thanks.
Dal raised his hand.
Yeah, I am hoping that in the future, right? We're trying to do it as generic as possible, but I don't think it's quite generic yet. When we're looking towards an Nefio SDK, right, a way for vendors to create operators using this, what I call it's a meta model, right? Because there's certain principles here for how the modeling is happening, so that we would make it very easy to consume these kinds of relationships, right, between within the package, right? Because they're implied relationships. So yeah, to make it more generic, so there'll be a Nefio way, right, of doing these CRs. Of course, at the end of the day, any vendor can just create their own CRs, ignore this meta model, right, and it would still work, right, because this is just KRM. But if you want to work with an Nefio style, then we will want it to be well supported, right, in an SDK.
Okay. So the other requirements we have is like a DNN, so which is a bit more 3GPP specific, but not completely, right? So here we also have the capability to say, I just want this prefix length, and you can basically decide also whether it's V4 or V6 and stuff like that. But you see that always the same theme comes back. You need some cap parameters to identify, do I want to have it local or not? And you need some specialization parameters on how they link together, right? Then, so that's one bucket. So this is basically this bucket here on the left. Now I'm going into the right bucket. So the right bucket of a package is actually the context that you want to provide that is specific to where you are going to deploy it, right? And we have at the moment 2 examples of those. One is this workload cluster that we discussed. The second is the networking part. And there is more than one, so more than one resources. At the moment in R1, we took a bit of a shortcut at the end. This is actually injected. This is always into the package, but we need to still do something to make it dynamic. But this was a shortcut because we didn't have the time. But this is contextual information actually as well. Okay, and there is more than one network resource into it, but I just took one example because they all look the same. Okay, and then the second, so the third thing that you have to do inside of a package is define your pipeline, if you will, right? So it's basically the upper part here. And so that's kind of what this does here. So here you basically define the functions. And so you see here at the top, these are the generic KPT functions that we leveraged out of the box. And then we have a set of functions that we built within Nephew, right? So you have a UPF deploy function. You have something that so he acts upon the UPF deployment. So this is the function that actually is going to, based on all these requirements, is going to give you that full context as this. And then you have interface, DNN, NAD, and blah, blah, blah. So these are a set of functions that are going to act upon that. Yes, Bernard, you have a question?
Yes, so I was just wondering, sort of, we're now still in the domain of what happens before the models are sort of being applied to the API. But I have sort of the feeling that we might come into a situation where a linear processing or a linear pipeline might not be sufficient enough to account for dependencies and changes in the infrastructure. That means, for instance, if you're looking at the deployment, you might have to look into what kind of clusters are available, what's the current situation, and then based on that, define the procedure which you would need to apply in order to do the injection specialization, etc. So any thoughts on how you would want to address that?
I have some thoughts on that, but I agree with you, is that the sequential execution is maybe something we have to look at. And I think we have a way to do so because we have conditions and stuff like that. So we actually have a way to accomplish this, I think. But yeah, John.
Yeah, like you're seeing functions here, but what the specialization process in particular, like all of this is declarative and reconciled, right? So it's not just a one shot goes straight through, but as changes in the shape of things happen, new drafts would be proposed or updates would happen, and certain pieces in the specialization are controllers that happen independently. So there are certain gates, right? There's a gate of publishing or approving a package so that it gets delivered down to the workload cluster, for example. I mean, changes can subsequently happen to that as the environment changes, and they go through those same gates. But it's not purely a linear
execution
process today, even other than the fact that there's certain approval gates.
Yeah, they're all idempotent, by the way, Bernard. So it's all idempotent. So basically, they will always achieve the same result. So you can run this thing 100 times, you will always get the same thing. So that's the good thing about it, I think. Yeah, but so the reason why I bring this up is because in our blueprint package, this is also part of it, right? So that means that once we define the blueprint package, someone has to put these functions in place, you see? And these functions, in a number of cases, if you have vendor-specific stuff inside here, some of them, in my view, will come from the service provider. Some of them will come from the vendor, maybe. And so you'll see that if you look to roles and responsibilities, I have the feeling this is important to look at. Because
I agree. Just wanted to point out that the conflict path aspect might change. Sort of. That means I would sort of assume that this is idempotent, but could be that sort of when calculating the sequence of actions to be conducted, that you have noticed, look here, there's one data center down, and basically in the config path, you have to reflect that somehow. And therefore, sort of the config path reference would have to change, or the document there would have to change. And therefore, it might not be in that manner idempotent, because if you're changing configuration, then basically you would also be changing the target state.
Yeah, if the context changes, then the results will change for sure.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's not idempotent in that sense. But given the same context and the same inputs. The other thing is we're looking at ways where you don't have to like list all of these things, right? Because I think Wim's getting to the point where like, if I've got different people, different roles that need different functions in here, having to put them all in one spot is kind of a bottleneck. And Wim and I at least have been talking about ideas of making this simpler. But I have to say we're past time.
Yes,
so
yeah. I have just one more slide, two more slides, and
Okay.
the other one is configuration parameters. So these config paths also have specific configuration information that is used for these functions. So I think why I put this together is to give you some real examples on how a package looks like, and you will see. I think it's important for these roles and responsibilities on how we manage that and so on and so forth. But there is on one hand high-level information, and on the other hand, some rather detailed information on how you manipulate that package. Okay, and that's actually what I had. So maybe if there are questions, given that we ran out of time, we could we can answer them or take them to Slack or something like that, or address them in the next meeting.
Thank you.
All
okay,
right.
Sana, so is that it for us, or should we wrap it up?
I'll quickly wrap it up. Wim, I think it's very good that you presented this. It's going to open up opportunities to basically refine our R2 requirements in a little bit more detail and keep this in context. I have pinned this slide to our Slack channel sticky notes. You can take a look at those sticky notes there. And in the next session, we have one tomorrow, which is by the Helm integration subgroup, and then we have one on Thursday. I just wanted to quickly ask if for Thursday meeting we could switch the time to 11 a.m. Pacific. I have a conflict for 9 a.m. this Thursday because of an internal meeting. Please reply back to me on the Slack, and I will update that meeting. And I have also given access to everybody else who requested me that they don't have access to the R2 requirements document. Make sure that you have access and you can contribute your requirements before Thursday. Wim, do you think you have any more questions coming? We can slot some more time for this discussion in the beginning of next meeting, whenever you're there, Tuesday or Thursday, or we can conclude that or take it offline and stack, whatever you guys prefer.
Yeah, I would say if there are questions on Slack or something like that, or maybe ask the question whether we need something in the next meeting, and then
Okay.
we can
Okay,
take it there. But let's try it Slack as much as we can, right? And then because otherwise,
yeah,
And-
you're right. We have this week to finalize our requirements. So let's gather as much inputs as we can into our R2 document.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Bernard, do you want some time slotted for you in the next meeting to go through your requirements?
Yeah,
In
but
light
it's
of today's
something.
discussion.
Yeah, that's something like 5 to 10 minutes. But I don't think it's sort of highlighting any very new things. It's just sort of
Yes.
trying to build
Yes.
upon what we've just discussed already.
Yeah, I reviewed that. Yeah, we will slot some time for you in the next meeting and we conclude. And Eric is not on the call, but I'll reach out to him offline to see if he has entered his requirements too. I think we are good to go. We can conclude. I'll be waiting for your feedback on the Thursday meeting time change request. See if you guys can make it. Otherwise, I will try to solve my internal conflict as well. Awesome, guys. We'll see you in the next meeting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.